All right, here we go. Okay, so welcome, A-Pushers. Welcome to the very first women's or A-Push live session here. And Ms. Povich is going to hand me Harley here. So Harley's kind of like, I know that you guys have wondered how Harley is, and my little puppy. I put pictures on Instagram of all the time. Whoops, he's got caught up here. So anyway, he wants to say hi to you guys. Hello, A-Pushers. Go kill that exam. Woo! You can do it. So anyway, here we are live, and let me see. This is the first time we've done this, so just be patient with Miss Povich and I. We can see we do have some viewers here, so that's good. And of course, if you can't make this, I'm hoping you're watching it through a replay, because that'll be available to you guys. And hopefully you have your outline. Okay, if you don't, Miss Povich and I will put that on our web pages here maybe afterwards. But anyway, so let's start talking about this because we're running 10 minutes late. I apologize that it took that long for us to get up there. We're newbies at this, so just be patient with us. All right, so I want you to take a look at this quote here for just a minute. Well-behaved women rarely make history. So I want you to think about that. That's a really famous quote, so I'll give you guys just a minute to think about that quote and see what it says. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Well-behaved women rarely make history. You might think, and actually, you might actually see this on, some feminist mantra, some T-shirts and things like that. A lot of people think that the meaning behind this is that you have to behave bad. It's a justification for behaving bad. And the person that actually wrote this was not her intent at all. And the honor of that goes to a woman named Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. And that's this scholar right here. She's a historian. And she actually, that was part of her dissertation when she was getting her doctorate degree. And what she wrote about was basically the fact that she had such a difficult time trying to find information on average women in colonial times. And that's because the only ones that actually made it to the record books in history were the ones that did something bad and ended up in court. Women didn't have a voice. And so that's why she ended up writing a Pulitzer Prize book on midwives in the colonial time period in the Northeast area. And she's a great scholar. She's got some really good books. Particularly, she's also a Mormon. She's written quite a few books on Mormon history. But anyway, she's a very fascinating woman. I studied her quite a bit when I was in graduate school, so I just thought I'd give her a shout out there. Okay, so beyond the fact that this is possible that we're going to be asking, or the APUSH, the College Board is going to be asking questions on the AP exam on women, it really helps you to understand the background on women's history for a number of reasons. You can have discussions with intelligent discussions, that is, with people about what happened to women over time. And the fact that women still have quite a bit of history left to write. We still have yet to have a woman president. There is no Equal Rights Amendment, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So lots of reasons why we should learn that. All right, so let's move on here a little bit. Okay, so anyway, I gave you, this should be on the very back of your paper, but I thought I would give you just a quick snapshot of how things happened over time. So colonial women, Republican motherhood. So this will go through the major things we'll be talking about today, how things kind of changed over time for women. So like I said, that should be all on the back of your handout that we gave you guys in class. All right, so let's start talking about what happened to women beginning in colonial time. And we're going to start with British America in particular. So we know that women did not arrive at Jamestown until a little bit later. The first people that came to Jamestown were men. They were supposed to be looking for gold, but unfortunately for the Virginia Company, who was the joint stock company who did this, who funded the Jamestown visit, they sent just men. And a lot of the women that arrived there were known as tobacco brides, and I know we've talked about that quite a bit in class. But anyway, a lot of them came to the colonies because it got them out of debtor's prison. So at the time period, there wasn't, phone calls where you would get debt collectors calling you or anything like that if you didn't pay a debt. You would actually go to a prison called a debtor's prison. And what we find is when the prisons start to become overcrowded, they start to find ways in the 17th century to still have them punished for not paying their debts, but obviously they're not like a violent offender. And so also a little bit later on, James Oglethorpe will found Georgia, which was founded as a debtors colony, and so was Australia. So the next group that arrives are the Pilgrims at the Mayflower, and they arrive with families. Their intent obviously was to escape religious persecution. And one thing to keep in mind when thinking about the colonies is that they were modeling themselves after Great Britain. So Great Britain at the time had a very matriarchal society. I'm sorry, patriarchal. Forget I said that. So they've got a very patriarchal society. So those customs follow them. However, because of the fact that things were different in the colonies, women were required to participate more in the daily lives. They actually ended up having a lot more rights in the colonies than they would have if they had stayed in England. So for women, that was, a plus in the colonial times. The other thing that's kind of a little bit morbid, but true, is the fact that the short lifespan, particularly of men in the colonial times, allowed women to become widows. And early on, widows were actually able to own their own property when their husband died. This is going to change later on, especially during, the cult of domesticity and the antebellum era. But at the time, it was, so the colonial time was, not the best. They certainly didn't have the same kind of rights that men did at the time, but, it was much better than a lot of people think about that. So here's some notable women from colonial times. Of course, Pocahontas. She in her own right was a princess. Her father was a king of the Powhatan Indians. And so she marries John Rolfe later on. I can't remember the year exactly that she married, in 1610 sometime. And she actually goes to England, and they anglicize her, and you probably remember the picture of her anglicized. They changed her name to Rebecca. And so she did, though, do quite a bit for her tribe in and of itself. And then Anne Hutchinson, who comes with the Puritans later on. So Anne Hutchinson, she spoke out. She actually had preaching activities in her own house, which was a big no-no at the time period. And she was banished from Massachusetts, and she goes to Rhode Island much later on. Sadly, she was killed not much later in an Indian raid. And then, of course, most of the APUSHers, you guys enjoy the Salem witch trials. Or maybe not enjoy it, but you're fascinated by the Salem witch trials. And of course, during the Salem witch trials, the majority of women were actually the ones targeted. 19 people in the end were hanged because of this. Okay, so we move on to the American Revolution. Of course, we're skipping quite a bit of history here, but we're talking specifically about the roles of women and how they change. But again, generally speaking, the American Revolution is viewed as an increase in rights for women during this time period. And I'm hoping, by the way, that you guys are asking, if you have questions, you're going to ask them along the way. Actually, if you guys are watching, and I do see some people watching, if you pop up a question and say hello or something like that, then so we know that that's working, that would be fantastic. But anyway, so in the American Revolution, like I said, women are gaining more rights, but it's mainly because of necessity. They needed to help participate in the movement in order to gain independence. They very much were active. Similar to the Sons of Liberty, the Daughter of Liberty, they were very involved in propaganda and putting posters up and encouraging people to join the patriotic cause. Some women did become nurses during the Revolutionary War, but interestingly, though, even though many of them became nurses, still the majority of nurses were men, even during the Revolutionary War. And of course, famously, Abigail Adams writes a letter to her husband, and when her husband was on the way to the Continental Congress, and she wrote a letter that's kind of been preserved through history called Remember the Ladies. And in it, she really tells her husband, don't forget the ladies when you all are making these plans, and kind of justifying why it was important to include women in the Constitution. But also, famously, John Adams, of course, thinks, that's cute. Not much different than what other men thought at the time. He certainly gave her much more equality and discussion than a lot of men during that time period. But Probably the most important thing for you to remember during this time period is Republican motherhood. So this is a really key word. I want you to definitely highlight this and draw some lines here because you need to know about Republican motherhood. This is a major shift in women's rights and the role of women. So basically what Republican motherhood is that, women's importance was really recognized and their key role in educating children. So in these new Republican values that have come about because of the American Revolution, women are seen as the first person really in contact with children. So in order to really preserve the legacy of Republican values in the United States, women need to be the ones to educate. So that encourages women to get educations. Like they never thought that was really necessary for women to get educations before that time period. And so, of course, it's a big role, and women were very involved in that. Okay, so some important women during the American Revolution themselves is, of course, Abigail Adams. We've already talked quite extensively about her. And then Molly Pitcher. She was, now she wasn't an actual person. Nobody can really point to Molly Pitcher at the time. This is an image of her with, somebody drew later on. But essentially Molly Pitcher was a combination of different folk heroes who, when their husband was shot or when their husband was down, they actually helped and stood in for their husband in order to fight the revolution. And then in 1790, a woman named Judith Sargent Murray wrote a book called On the Equality of Sex. And in that book, she promotes the continuing education and why it's important for women to be educated also. Okay, so we have a big screech here in women's rights. We're going to enter into antebellum time period, which begins roughly in the early 1800s. There's no specific time for antebellum. By the way, the word antebellum in Latin means before war. So this is the time period before the Civil War, and then during the Civil War too. This is basically seen as a time in which rights really diminished for women. And so, in particular, this is a big word. Just like the term Republican motherhood was important, this term cult of domesticity was very important. So essentially, what it said was that women they could be wives and mothers, but they shouldn't be in the public sphere. And the real reason for this is because as we progress as a country technologically, women don't need to be in the fields or be participating as much in the daily lives as men do. So again, we see the necessity of women being involved change. So does the rights of women. So many women, they are able to get out of the house through something called, textile mills. And of course, we know textiles mean clothing. Hang on just a minute. Let me grab Harley here. Where is Harley? Is he over there? I think he might be bothering Miss Povich a little bit. So we're gonna take Harley back. Hey guys. Hey, I'm over here bothering everybody. So anyway, so stay right here, Harley. Stay with me. So anyway, needless to say, the Lowell girls were a group of women that went to the Lowell factory in Massachusetts, and they essentially left the farms, and they went there, and this was it was a way for women to actually gain some autonomy. And by the way, when we talk about the big four, that word autonomy is going to be super key. So make sure you understand the word autonomy. You're going to sound super intelligent when you write this on the exam. Autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. But anyway, so basically these were single women that went into the mills. Their lives were extremely restricted during that time period. They couldn't... they had to live by very strict codes. They lived together in rooms, and they weren't allowed to leave the Lowell mill without an escort. They had curfews that they had to abide to. So this was really why, the fathers of these girls didn't have any issue with them working at the Lowell mills, because number one, it brought in money for the family, but number two, there were very strict rules that they had to abide by. So But again, this was a good thing for women. By the way, something important and key to keep in mind during this time period is that once women were married, most of the states, many of the states, did not permit women to work after they were married, and so once they were married, they couldn't really be working in mills. Okay, so we're continuing on. One key thing about the antebellum time period is the early reform movements. Women are super involved in these early reform movements. In particular, temperance is the one in which women are really touted as, and it's really accepting for women to become involved in because of the fact that this focus on family, this is a focus on Christian values, and Christian values at the time said alcohol was a sin, and and things like that. There are also the ones that are the victims of alcohol during this time period, women and children. So for that reason, they become very much in charge, kind of taking the lead on this in temperance. There were many women involved in the abolition movement, not just because they wanted rights for African Americans, but also they thought that if they fought for rights for African Americans, that rights for women would come alongside of them. Of course, we find out with the 15th Amendment that they were wrong about that comes much later than that. So a lot of key players of women who are very involved in this, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But of course, the most significant thing that happens for women during antebellum was the Seneca Falls Convention. So you definitely need to know that. You need to know that date. That's an anchor date onto period 3. No, wait, am I right? Period 4. And so this is the very first women's rights convention. At the time they write the Declaration of Sentiments, which is right here on the right. Essentially it mocks the Declaration of Independence and says, it's set up just like the Declaration of Independence. If you put them side by side, you would know that they were intentionally mocking it. But instead of putting grievances against the king in there, they essentially put all the reasons why they're upset with men, so grievances against men. And a lot of people really think they're under this misconception that Seneca Falls was mostly about voting rights, and although I would definitely agree that some women were looking towards those political voting rights, most of what they were focused on during the Seneca Falls Convention was basic human rights. They weren't permitted to divorce. They had very little recourse if they were abused by their husband. They weren't allowed to divorce even if he was abusive. And so for all these reasons, and they weren't allowed, many of them were not allowed to get an education. So there's some just basic rights that they felt that they were not entitled to that they should be. Also keep in mind that during this time period, the Declaration of Sentiments was laughed at. The whole Seneca Falls Convention was laughed at. Nobody very much took it seriously. They didn't really get anything out of it. But women's historians and also obviously women's rights movement that takes a bigger leaps in the early 20th century, they look at the Seneca Falls as their first organized time to really protest their rights. So that's why we look at it, and that's why it's such a key event. Now, during the Civil War itself, women actually become nurses quite a bit more. They actually replace men more so with nursing and also with sanitation. And so in particular, a little story about women in nursing is the fact that women were generally caretakers for their families and used to seeing the sight of blood and things like that, could handle the ugliness of the Civil War. Remember that the mini ball is created at this time, and so it just kind of goes into their body and blows up in their system, and so there was a lot of gore. A lot of men that were nurses and working in the ambulance corps at that time were getting very sick, and they were drinking a lot, and so it was making a lot of the men not very capable of being nurses. But women really stepped up to the plate and became nurses during the Civil War. So that was another big turning point for them. So there's so many women here that I won't be able to go over all of the women individually. But here's some, the Grimke sisters, which are super fascinating abolitionist women. They came from the South, very prominent South Carolina family. And of course, Harriet Tubman, one of the main conductors of the Underground Railroad. Clara Barton was the founder of the Red Cross, and she also was in charge of sanitation. Sanitation, of course, was very important, as the Civil War actually has more death by disease than they have anything else. All right, so we're moving into the Progressive Era, and in the Progressive Era, the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, Um, we have to understand the background, the context of what's happening in the United States at the time. Um, Generally speaking, this is more of an increase in rights. Some of the states, as you can see, actually granted more divorce rights for women during this time period if they were abused or if the men deserted them. So this was a step up for them. Because of the increase of factory jobs and factory availabilities, women are able to go into the workforce, mainly in the textile mills, but and of course the laws are still in place, or if they're not de facto, if they're not actually de jure laws that are written in the books, they're de facto laws where you just know that once you're married you don't work anymore. They became clerks and bookkeepers. But again, this one's really important. We have a second wave of reform movements that happen at this time period. Mainly middle class women become what we call muckrakers. And these are middle class educated women. And muckrakers at that time, and hopefully you remember muckrakers, so that's a key part in the Gilded Age. But if not, we'll be going over period 6 on Monday before and after school. But essentially, muckrakers were people that went into the city and undercover a lot, like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and exposed the ills of society. And so we find a lot of women muckrakers at the time, like Nellie Bly, who was for the plight of the criminally insane. We also see the temperance movement gain quite a bit of strength, so that's going to take a big role. They're actually going to get a Prohibition Amendment passed, the 18th Amendment, in 1919, and so that was a big win for women that were pushing for temperance. Women also create their own organizations that were specifically focused on suffrage. In particular, like the National Women's Party, which was founded by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. I don't think that one is taught as much in American history, and that's sad because I think their role in it, they take a lot more militant role in getting the 20th Amendment, or I'm sorry, the 19th Amendment finally passed in 1920, was pretty significant. Okay, so speaking of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, which was passed in 1920, or it was ratified, in 1920. It actually passed but got ratified in the states in 1920. A year before it was actually ratified by Congress, or signed by Congress. But anyway, interesting to note on this that a lot of students have a couple misperceptions about the women's suffrage movement. First of all, they think that there was no voting for women across the country before this amendment, and this is not true. Most of the states actually had already passed their own suffrage laws, and so they just felt that it wasn't fully complete unless the federal government recognized the right of women to vote and have these political rights. And there were some states that looked pretty reluctant to pass women's suffrage laws, and so this would force all states to recognize that. So that was really the importance of that. Couple reasons why women participate heavily in World War I. That occurs from, Americans' role was really 1917, but the war itself begins in 1914 and ends in 1919. But a lot of these more militant organizations, like Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, were part of the National Women's Party, become very influential. They would starve themselves, they would chain themselves to cars and to fences at the White House and use a lot more militant strategies. And so a combination of this mixed with the fact that women were more involved in World War I. Finally, Woodrow Wilson pushes for this too. Finally, now it wasn't initially, but passes for that amendment to be passed. Okay, so the 1920s itself for women was seen as a win for rights. Women called flappers come out during the 1920s, and these are women that are completely different than the women that we think of, the Victorian-style women of the time period. They have very short bobs. You can tell over here they have short skirts. They were much more promiscuous and much more expressive. This is also the time period of Prohibition. So Prohibition, anti-alcohol, passed in 1919, and so you have speakeasies that form. Before that, women never went into bars, but during Prohibition, actually, these speakeasies were like underground bars that people would go into, and women for the first time go into these speakeasies and go into these bars. And so you can see for women at least they feel a lot more liberated during this time period. Um, so, again, National Women's Party, they do in 1923 introduce an Equal Rights Amendment. It never gets passed. It doesn't even get talked about until the 1970s, well, really 1960s, with Betty Friedan, which we'll talk about in a minute. Another thing is Margaret Sanger, really in the late 1800s, early 20th century, starts to begin her promotion of birth control and talking about birth control and educating women so they don't have to just be baby machines. They can somehow control how many children they're having. And so she was mainly, really vilified in the public at the time period, but obviously, 1960s and 70s, when the feminist movement picks up speed again, she gets a lot more say. And famously, Eleanor Roosevelt over here, she becomes the first lady, and that's not a typo there, I meant to put that, to take a really active role in politics. Her husband very much recognized her intelligence and what she could contribute politically to him, and so she becomes very active. As a matter of fact, in 1945, she becomes our first representative to the United Nations. It's after her husband had passed away, and she, with the help of others, writes the Universal Rights, Suffrage, Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you, Ms. Povich. Couldn't think of the name of there. Alrighty. So World War II, again, was seen as an increase in women's rights, and we know that, again, just like this is a continuity that you could talk about if you ever did this. Just like in colonial times, it was a necessity. Just like in the American Revolution, when women's roles take a necessity. Same thing in World War II. Men leave the home front. They leave the home front. They go and fight the war. This leaves factory jobs for women. And as we remember and we think back to World War II, FDR called it a GNP war. Essentially, we had to outproduce the enemy. And in order to do that, we needed women, and African Americans at that matter too, in the factories working, producing things so that we could outproduce our enemy and outproduce Hitler and the Japanese. And so this becomes very important. So let's look at some of the statistics that are on the screen here on this. So women do replace men here. They found like a new freedom, having their own money and working. Women make up 1/3 of the workforce. That's super significant when you think about the fact that there's still married women out there. And even married women were working at that time. Another significant thing is that women actually played an active role in the war itself, not just on the home front in the war. They served as nurses again. They were also test pilots, famously WASP, the Women's Air Force Service Pilot. That's what WASP stands for. There were some women spies, particularly in code breaking, and even women served as mechanics. And so lots of roles women took in World War II. All right, so we take a big screech here. Again, because now that we had this buildup of women's increasing roles, now we take a huge step back with the 1950s. And again, we have to think about the context of this, okay? So men are coming home. We have 12 million vets that come home, and they need the jobs. And so women lose their jobs in the factories, and some women, acquiesce. They're okay with that. They go back and they leave. But, a lot of women obviously, and we'll find out later on, become very kind of resentful of this. There was a huge baby boom after when the men came home, and so women were expected to kind of return to the household. This will be cult of domesticity part 2. So that's the way you need to think about like the 1950s, really the cult of domesticity part 2. And again, this is going to plant the seeds for the 1970s feminist movement. Even if they do work, they work in what we consider traditional women's jobs, like clerical jobs as secretaries and things like that. And if they do have jobs, the same job as a man, they earn 60% of what men do. I'm sorry. And we still see a wage gap today, by the way. It's closed. It continues to close, but there's still a wage gap between men and women today. All right, so in walks the feminist movement and the anti-feminist movement. Oh, and I meant to mention back when I was talking about suffrage that a lot of students are under the perception that all women in 1919 and 1920 wanted suffrage, and that's not true. There were a lot of women, they called themselves anti-suffragettes, and they actually did believe that women should stay at home, that women that politics was dirty work and that women should not be involved in that. And so there were a lot of anti-suffragettes, and that's something that surprises a lot of my girls that take, history, and it is true that there were quite a bit. In addition to that, we have somebody here too, Phyllis Schlafly, who's very much against the Equal Rights Amendment. And so we're going to talk about that. So essentially it's going to be Betty Friedan here versus Phyllis Schlafly. But Betty Friedan, very intelligent, highly educated Jewish woman. She writes the book The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And she claims that women have much more to offer society than just being a housewife. She criticizes this cult of domesticity part two that has emerged. Her book itself, called The Feminine Mystique, inspires the feminist movement. And her and others form this organization called NOW, the National Organization for Women, still in existence today. And they pursue equal treatment for women, more opportunity, and they also push, very importantly, and this is one of these key things you have to remember too, the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment was actually ratified passed by Congress, but it needed 38 states. That's 3/4, I believe, right, Ms. Povich? 3/4. It needed 38 states in order to be ratified. It only gets 35. To this day, it has not been ratified. So the women are actually not a protected group other than the voting rights in the Constitution, like many other groups are. So today, our Constitution, with all the amendments that it does have, there's nothing in there about women's rights. But what stops it is Phyllis Schlafly. She led a very strong Stop ERA, and in particular, she hones in on people's fears that if an equal right amendment would be passed, that women would be expected to participate in combat and be drafted just like men. And you have to think about the context of the time, 1970s, Vietnam, people are just getting out of the war. She knows how to play this and very much stomp the Equal Rights Amendment. But one other thing that happened significantly during the 1970s in the feminist movement was Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion up to a certain time. And so that's still in the books, although it's constantly being challenged. So where are we today, ladies? Like I just talked about, the Equal Rights Amendment has never been passed. Sandra Day O'Connor, shout out O'Connor High School, right? Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981 was appointed the very first woman on the Supreme Court. That was significant. Thurgood Marshall was the first African American nominated to serve on the Supreme Court, and he went on 1967. So that shows you the gap with rights between women or blacks and women many times. But anyway, Geraldine Ferraro in 1984 ran against Reagan with Walter Mondale. She became the first woman to candidate in a major party, one of the major parties. And of course, Hillary Clinton runs against President Trump in 2016. Her husband, Bill Clinton, her brainchild was national health care, which eventually gets passed by Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, during his presidency. So I think that's about it. I have no idea if you all even tried to ask questions, because I didn't see any questions pop up, and I don't think you saw any. Did you, Ms. Povich? All right, so it looks like we're at 33 minutes. I think that's pretty good. And you should be able to fill in all your stuff on your outline. If you have any other questions, you can email me about it in general. And I guess we'll sign off from our very first APUSH Live. Have a great day, APUSHers. And oh, wait, importantly, listen, okay? 5 o'clock, Ms. Povich will be presenting on Native Americans, change and continuity over time. That's a big one. Can definitely see that one as a possibility of a question too. So hopefully you guys will tune in to that. If not, hopefully you'll watch it later. Thanks so much. Bye.